Santiago Canyon College is an innovative learning community in Orange, California, with more than 260 certificate and degree programs. Santiago Canyon College is a proud sponsor of community programming and OC World.
OC World is made possible by the generous contributions of Marisla Foundation, Keith and Judy Swain Family Foundation, Wells Fargo Bank, the University of California, Irvine, Orange County Community Foundation, Farmers and Merchants Bank, and viewers like you. Thank you.
For decades, wildfires have been a part of the natural cycle of Southern California, shaping its ecosystems and landscapes. However, in recent years, these fires have become an all too common occurrence, leaving devastation in their wake. Each year, these infernos ravage thousands of acres of land, destroy homes, and uproot lives, leaving communities grappling with a devastating aftermath. Roughly 4 years ago, Orange County experienced perhaps one of its worst wildfire seasons ever.
Out of Southern California, where there is a fast-moving brush fire threatening more than 21,000 people just south of Los Angeles.
The so-called coastal fire has burned about 200 acres, has torched more than 24 homes in Orange County.
Changing, but here's the latest for you. The flames have burned at least 200 acres, and at least 24 homes are either destroyed or damaged. That number is likely to go up. At this hour, there is no containment.
Fire season generally is year-round now, and you know, I started my fire service career back in 1978 and worked for the Forest Service and spent time, about 13 years, on hotshot crews. And back then, we had a really defined fire season. You could about set your watch on June 1st. You know, the grasses were going to be dry, we're going to burn, and by December 1st, the rains would be here, and you really had a very defined fire season, and not much in between in Southern California or Northern California, or throughout the West for that matter. But that's changed. It's changed over time, and so now we have experienced fires in all months of the years over the last 10 years. So certainly things have changed for us.
Is Orange County particularly vulnerable to wildfires, and if so, why?
Yeah, Orange County is particularly vulnerable to wildfires, and this is why, you know, we have a very arid summer. I mean, this is all, we consider ourselves part of that LA basin in many ways. And just the geography and the temperatures, you know, the steep geography is conducive to fire spread. You know, even on a day where it's not windy, on a quote unquote normal day, depending on where that fire is ignited, you know, it has the ability to run uphill very fast. And now that we're largely built out in Orange County, you know, just about every fire we go to is going to threaten lives and property. You know, you turn on the wind, you know, typically in the fall and early winter parts, well, you know, you've seen the destruction here in Orange, LA County. I mean, we typically can lose dozens, if not hundreds of homes. So, yeah, this place has got a lot of fire history.
When was the last most significant wildfire here in Orange County?
I think just a few years ago in 2021, I believe it was 2021, we had the Wildfire. We actually had 2 fires that year, pretty significant fires. One, the Silverado, and then another, the Wildfire, in early mid-December. And both those fires, burned for several thousand acres. And the Silverado fire, which was about a month, maybe a month and a half before the Wildfire, burned all the way close to where we're sitting today. It burned all the way down to Portola, came over the top, Santa Ana wind driven, and thankfully we didn't lose any homes. And that in large part was due to the community and the developers and how they developed those structures.
I don't understand why there's such now a major concern for these wildfires increasing. What are sort of the circumstances that's leading to that?
Yeah, and I don't have the statistics in front of me, so I don't know necessarily that they're increasing. Certainly, in the West, or at least in Southern California, the last couple of years, we've had a lot of moisture, and so they've actually decreased. But what we're seeing is fire spread in ways that we haven't seen before. We went through a pretty significant drought for a lot of years. Well, that killed the vegetation. And of course, after it rains like it has been the last few years, and especially this winter, that dead fuel, and we consider it fuel, is still intermixed in that vegetation. So when you look up on the hillside, you see a lot of green, flowering brush. You got to remember, there's a huge dead component still within that dead vegetation. That chaparral is not coming back. It's still on the side of those hills. So really, it only takes the newer growth to dry out, and we have a fire problem. But we are seeing fire spread in ways, quite frankly, throughout the West that we haven't seen before, that don't match up to the models that we've had.
Roughly 80 to 85% of wildfires in Southern California are caused by human activities and negligence. In some cases, downed power lines and arson. Other causes include drought, burning debris and wind, lightning, fireworks, and some argue rising temperatures due to climate change.
The key to fighting wildfire is really a quick response with force. So we like to call speed and force. That's been the key all along, and now what we're finding, because from ignition to spread is happening so fast, that we need to be very quick on the response, which I think we always have been, but we need to throw a lot at it. That's a lot of aircraft, a lot of ground resources. The days of waiting for somebody to arrive and say, yeah, no, there's actually a fire here, gone. I mean, somebody calls 911 today, even though it's green as it is, man, we're pushing a lot of resources out to make sure, that fire is, if it exists, is going to be, dealt with very quickly.
What about this concept about climate change and its impact on the environment and the potential spread of additional wildfires?
Yeah, that's what most of my colleagues and I believe is the real difference. We having fought fire in the late 70s, throughout the 80s, 90s, and into this century. We first saw the change in the early 2000s, in 2003. Down south in San Diego with the Cedar Fire that burned 280,000 acres and burned thousands of structures, and I believe killed 14, 15 people. That was the birth of what we would call the mega fire, right? And that record held for a long time, and then just over the last 5, 6, 7 years, we far eclipsed that. The Cedar Fire is now only one of the top 10 fires, but we've had million-acre fires here in California. Given the long period of drought, and even when it does get hot and it does get windy, we still are getting those vegetation fires that spread very quickly. We believe it has to be climate change, and I'm very involved with the other Western states and the fire chiefs and associations. And what used to be a Southern California problem back in the 80s, 90s, and into the early 2000s, especially in the fall, is no longer that way. We're seeing large fires in Colorado. Texas burned 1.2 million acres.
Tonight, the destruction is catastrophic as fast-moving infernos raged across Colorado, more than tripling in size in less than 24 hours.
In an instant, the inferno surrounded rural communities, sending livestock fleeing and people rushing to evacuate.
The fire problem is exponentially worse than it was, 10 years ago, 20 years ago.
Are there communities in Orange County currently that are particularly vulnerable to fires?
Well, I think we've seen that, and you mentioned some of those fires, the Laguna, Hills fire back in 1993, that came over the top, wind driven and into Emerald Bay and Laguna Beach. We have what we call fire corridors. We know the history of this county. We had the Freeway fire back, I think, in 2007, and we had another one that was burned very much the same way. I think it was Canyon, Water Canyon 2, in 2018. So we know, where these fires have traditionally gone. And if you go back, for however long they've recorded fire history here in this county, you'll see many of the same footprints. And we used to say it'd take about 25 years before there'd be another fire. And it would repeat itself because of vegetation. That's happening now in 5, 6, 7 year rotations. We're seeing type conversion. We're seeing invasive, plant species now where we didn't before. And we've developed and built in these canyon areas and on ridge tops. The Blue Ridge Fire, I think it was called, over Yorba Linda here a few years ago. We're very lucky we only lost a handful of homes there, but all those homes are right up on the ridge lines and fire ran up to them. I don't know how long they've built up there, but you can imagine they weren't always there. And so part of it is, again, development has moved into areas that have very strong fire history. We try to, make sure that those new communities are built to code, that we have fire stations nearby, that they're sprinklered, perhaps whatever we need to do. But when the wind blows, all bets are off.
For many, the trauma of wildfires lingers long after the smoke clears. The psychological toll on residents, first responders, and volunteers is immeasurable as they grapple with loss, anxiety, and uncertainty about the future. Dawn O'Brien and her family were caught in the coastal fire in May of 2022. They were evacuated and misplaced for approximately a month.
So we woke up on a normal day with no warnings of the fire. The fire had taken place down in the canyon in Laguna Beach, and literally within a half hour, the fire helicopters were flying over, basically telling us to leave the home and gather our stuff and leave as quickly as possible. The winds were very, very strong that day, and the fire turned very quickly. We were thankful that we just suffered smoke damage. Our neighbors the same. We did have one house down the street that was a complete loss, and they're rebuilding now. I believe there were 20 to 26 homes that were devastated and completely devastated up on Coronado Point, and they're now rebuilding, which is wonderful to see. But it's a scary time, scary moment, and you have to think fast, and you don't ever think this is going to happen to you.
Michael O'Connell is president and CEO of Irvine Ranch Conservancy, a nonprofit organization that manages roughly 30,000 acres of public urban wildlands in partnership with OC Parks and other public agencies. In 2020, 2 major fires burned roughly a third of the land that the Irvine Ranch Conservancy manages. More than 90,000 people were evacuated.
Coastal Southern California has a different kind of habitat than we find in the Sierras and some of our forested areas of California. We have what's called shrublands. You can see there aren't any trees here, and it also has a very different kind of fire history and fire regime than you find in the forests. In contrast to the Sierras, where there hasn't been enough fire over time, and we get large fires that burn lots of dead trees, Southern California has had too much fire. These areas are supposed to burn about once every 70 to 150 years, and now they're burning every 7 to 10 years. And what happens is you get these plants that are green most of the year, these native plants, and they get replaced by mustard and some of these other grasses that are not native. Instead of staying green until September or October like the native plants do, these plants will die and start to look like this in about 6 weeks. It's the primary reason why our wildfire season is year-round now. Non-native plants came to Southern California in a number of different ways. They came as landscaping materials. The mustard was actually brought by the Spanish missionaries who brought it from the Mediterranean area, and they actually marked the trail between the missions by planting mustard seeds. But the mustard escaped, and it's essentially growing wild just about everywhere. You can see this is a really healthy native habitat here. These yellow flowers here are California sunflowers, and they will remain green all the way into the fall. We see deerweed, we see artemisia, which is California sagebrush. But if you look up here on the hill, it turns out that that area is not very healthy. You can see all the little yellow mustard flowers. Everybody thinks they're really beautiful, and they are for about 6 weeks, and then they turn brown and they turn dead, and they carry the fire while this area remains green. So what we try to do is we try to restore these native plants, which are much more resistant to fire than the invasive ones. And if you get an area that has a lot more invasives, it becomes much more fire prone, and that's why these areas are burning every 7 to 10 years. It turns out when you're looking at the kinds of ignitions that occur, most of them occur along our roadways, and there are a bunch of different kinds. You can have people that pull over into the dry grass with a hot engine and start a fire, people throwing a cigarette butt out the window. We have arsonists that use roadways as a way to get to an area where they can light a fire. We also have an interesting thing. We had a major fire in the early 2000s started by a catalytic converter that burst. I actually have a piece of that catalytic converter. The fire was called the Freeway Complex Fire, and it was in Brea in Yorba Linda. And this is a piece of a catalytic converter, which is a ceramic disc that sits in the tailpipe of the car. And what it does is it vaporizes all the unburned fuel that comes out of the engine, and then it just comes out the tailpipe. This piece of ceramic is designed to operate at 1,600 degrees Fahrenheit. It melts at close to 2,500 degrees Fahrenheit. And what happens is if you have an engine that's not well tuned and it's shooting out lots of gasoline vapors, it will hit this catalytic converter and melt it and burst it. And this piece of hot ceramic went out the tailpipe of the car, landed on the side of the road, and caused a major wildfire. 80% of all of our ignitions occur along roadways, and it turns out that there's so many different ways that they start that there's no way to stop those ignitions at the source. What we have to do is make our roadways more resistant to fire. And that's an activity that we're working on actively now. We're working with Caltrans and we're working with the Public Works Department in Orange County to try to make the roadways more resistant so that when this happens, it doesn't get into the dry brush. Turns out that our risk for these catastrophic fires only occurs when these strong winds are blowing. So the Santa Ana wind event combined with an ignition, that is when you get a catastrophe. These Santa Ana winds right now only occur 18 to 20 days a year. So if you're driving on the freeway, a beautiful day like today, nothing to worry about, right? But if you're driving on the freeway and the winds are blowing 40, 50, 60 miles an hour and there's dry brush, don't pull off into the brush. Keep your eyes open. If you see somebody pulling off and some suspicious activity, call 911. Everybody has a role in preventing these ignitions, even though it may seem like, what do I do along a roadway, right? There's a lot that you can do as a driver. We have so many people on our freeways. We have so many eyes on the freeways, and we can all help prevent these ignitions.
Irvine Ranch Conservancy received a 3-year grant from the California Department of Conservation under the Regional Forest and Fire Capacity Program to expand its collaborative wildfire prevention efforts, including the prevention of roadside ignitions. It seems that healthy natural habitats are more resistant to impacts of extreme weather.
We've also done a countywide survey to understand a little bit more about how the community thinks about wildfire, whether they understand how it works and how they can get involved. And we're going to use that as the basis of a campaign that you're going to start to see rolled out to start educating people and getting them more involved in preventing wildfires.
If you could have your druthers, what sort of resources would you need currently to help you do your job better?
You know, as I mentioned earlier, really the key to suppressing or slowing these fires down is a very rapid response and a lot of force behind it. And I'd like to say that thankfully, we've got that here. We've got a pretty significant, aviation bureau. We have a relationship with Southern California Edison. When I say we, myself, Los Angeles County and the Ventura County fire chiefs, where Edison has ponied up about $36 million so that we have these very large helitankers in each of our counties. They drop 3,000 gallons, as opposed to our helicopters now that drop about 350. So it's significant. They fly day and night. They're staffed today. It's a 24-hour, 365 program. So we've got resources. Could we use more? Of course we could use more. But I think the problem really starts to occur, or where we start to see it here in California within our mutual aid system, is when you get multiple fires. If we had, you name the day in the summer, if we're the only game in town, we're going to be pretty resource rich. We're likely going to get the air tankers and the helicopter. We're going to get all that. Well, now you break another big fire in LA or something in Santa Barbara and then Northern California gets lightning. All of a sudden the resources start to get a little thin. And while we'd still have a very robust, what we call initial attack response on the 911 call, if a fire is outpacing the amount of resources or what we can do, getting help becomes very difficult. It comes, but it comes much slower. And as we discussed, the speed of which we're seeing fires spread, across the landscape, if we don't pin those fires down very, very quickly in the very beginning, we could be in big trouble. And getting resources to assist us, if there is other activity in California or the West, becomes a challenge. And we saw that up north a few years ago. And we see it every year now in the Great Basin, I think the Northwest last year. These fires get so big, there aren't enough firefighters, there aren't enough airplanes, there aren't enough helicopters, bulldozers to put these fires out. We literally have to wait for Mother Nature. We have to wait for the season to change and the fall rains or the winter rains and snow to come before these fires are extinguished. That didn't happen, more than 10 years ago.
But do you have any numbers on sort of the environmental and socioeconomic impacts of wildfires, either here in Southern California or just in terms of Orange County?
I mean, it's significant. Even 20 years ago, we talked earlier about the Cedar Fire in 2003. It caused, I don't know that it made $100 million to suppress, but the loss was calculated in the billions when it came to that fire. When you're talking about shutting down airports, shutting down the economy, where the fire is impacting, the people in downtown San Diego weren't affected by the fire, but the smoke that layered in there, the flights weren't coming into Lindbergh Airport. An NFL game had to be played in another state. I mean, and we experienced that here. You shut people down for a few days, or you displace them through an evacuation, and they can't go to work and those sorts of things. There's huge economic and social issues that really, they're calculated after the fact, but it's not much. The public didn't hear much about that.
According to California Department of Forestry and Fire Protection, in 2024, fire season in the state presents a mixed scenario due to diverse conditions. Any imbalances between drought, rainfall, snowpack, and weather patterns raises concerns that call for more vigilant monitoring and preparedness. As Orange County faces an uncertain future when it comes to wildfire season, the need for action has never been more urgent. Through resilience, innovation, and a shared commitment to stewardship, communities need to forge a path forward and safeguard their homes, their environment, and their way of life. There are simple yet effective measures homeowners can take to reduce the risk of collateral damages from wildfires, restoring wetlands, removing dry and invasive grasses, and using fire-resistant materials when constructing homes and buildings.
I think one of the most important things that we try to get people to realize is that the protection of these wildlands and keeping them healthy also protects our communities. If wildfire is our single greatest risk to these lands, too frequent wildfire is the single greatest risk to these lands, it's also one of the greatest risks to the communities that are living around them, and everyone should be working together in order to prevent that. People can do things like create defensible space around their homes. They can harden their homes, like boxing their eaves and screening their vents to keep embers from intruding. One of the things we learned in our countywide survey that it surprised me was how few people understand that it's the embers that are blown by the fire that cause most of the damage. It turns out that an ember from a wildfire in Southern California can travel 5 miles downwind. I've actually personally watched helicopter video of a fire in the Santa Clarita Valley, and it was burning on one side of the 5 freeway, and it was lighting houses on fire on the other side of the freeway, simply because of the embers. So if people understand that embers are where our risks are, winds are when we're worried, and we need to prevent ignitions during that time, that's the most important thing we can do.
But I think a lot of us also, when we think about fires, don't really think about it until they're happening.
That's right.
And we don't prepare in advance.
I saw this percentage the other day, I can't remember what it was, but it was like 2/3 of the residents in the United States are in what we would call wildland urban interface, in an area that can burn, and this goes back east and whatnot. And I think it comes down to, again, don't believe it can't happen to you. And you need to be prepared. If you're preparing the day of the fire, you might be too late. There are things you can do to become ready, to know where your the valuables are, what you want to take with you. And then when that smoke's in the air, be alert, whether you're at work or not, you're listening to radio reports, because once law enforcement shuts the roads down, you're not getting back. And when we say go, I think that's the first thing is, we can't force you out of your home here in California. But if you choose to stay and your house is not defendable, you could die losing that house.
The fire department, Orange County, Laguna Beach, Newport Beach, all the fire departments from around the area came, and police department as well. And so super thankful for them. They do a heroic job, and again, their jobs are to do the best. I mean, were they able to save every house? No, unfortunately not. But if you look up above, a lot of these people were thankful. We were thankful, and it was really cute. Days after, on the sides, the kids had put signs on the street saying, thank you to the fire department. Sorry. It's a very emotional and scary thing to go through.